And that was probably the biggest high, if you will, that a 17-year-old can have, to pulling the lanyard on a 155 millimeter round, having the impact and the recoil, and maybe 30 seconds later hearing an explosion, or seeing it light up the sky late at night. It was a head rush for a 17-year-old.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Good evening. The stunning overthrow of Mikhail Gorbachev by communist hardliners dominates the news this Monday. Gorbachev was reported under house arrest as Soviet tanks took up positions throughout Moscow.
5, 2, 7, 1, 6, 6, 9, 8, 3.
Poland's military leader, General Jaruzelski, urged the Polish people tonight not to demonstrate on Tuesday, the second anniversary of the founding of the banned trade union Solidarity.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
Today we speak to Manuel Alzaga, who as a 17-year-old joined the US Army in 1981. Manuel signed up to the artillery and tells his story from a life of poverty in Los Angeles through to deployment in Germany for Reforger. Before we get going, you can really help us get more listeners by leaving reviews on iTunes or with your favourite podcast provider. This really helps to raise our profile and get guests onto the show. If you'd like to support us with a few dollars, pounds or rubles, then head over to coldwarconversations.com and click on the Support the Podcast menu option to learn more. Thank you so much to all our fans that are supporting us. It is really appreciated. Now, back to today's episode. We start by talking about Manuel's early life. Manuel, can you tell me about your early life and how you ended up in the army in the first place?
Sure. I grew up in Los Angeles. My parents were legal immigrants to the United States. My dad was basically a factory worker. My mom stayed at home. And we're basically pretty poor. And I wasn't the best student. Let me put it to you that way. I got in trouble. I just never went. And my last year of school, I got held back. And one of my teachers said, you better start thinking about what you want to do with your life. And at that time, my dad and we had a very bad relationship. And I just wanted to get out. So this is 1981. And thank God I did graduate on time. But even before I graduated, I wanted to get out of Los Angeles. I wanted to get out and I wanted to go somewhere else, to get away from my family, to get away from the poverty. And there weren't too many jobs open out there. So I looked in the Army. That's the first thing I did because my family had a long tradition of going into the Army ever since, Vietnam. So I did what was called the late entry program, whereas I took my tests, I took my physicals. In December of 1980, I was still in school. And I qualified for a bunch of things, but I didn't want to sit behind a desk, if you will. I remember telling the recruiter, well, I want to be in the Army, blowing stuff up. So he said, well, you scored pretty high in whatever test. How about artillery? And I said, what's that? And he said, well, it's the big guns, and you go out there. And it's like, yeah, let's do that. And again, keep in mind, I was 17.
Yeah.
The recruiter had to come to my house and get legal permission from my parents to sign me up. Because when my graduation was in June of 81 from high school, and then maybe about 5 weeks after that, I shipped out and went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And I was still 17 when I went to boot camp.
Wow.
So my parents begrudgingly signed, but I told them, once I'm 18, I'm out of here anyways.
Yeah.
So
did your dad serve in Vietnam?
No, my dad was a Mexican immigrant.
Right. You said there was a family history of being in
right.
the military.
My cousins that all lived in California and Los Angeles and that area, they were here since maybe the 20s or 30s. And many of my uncles served in World War II in the Pacific. One of my uncles served in Okinawa. And then I had many uncles that, of course, served in Vietnam. And I remember clearly one of them, his name was called Uncle Joe. He came back and he was just a mess. He drank a lot. And I didn't know at the time it was like PTSD and what the war was. I thought it was all fun because I was maybe 6 years old. But I remember clearly my cousins coming back from Vietnam and just being messed up.
Yeah.
But also the stories intrigue me. You know, that, I guess if you call it the romanticism of war, which is maybe the wrong choice of words. But as a kid, I just found the military fascinating. I always have. I always had Army toys, like G.I. Joes. I always loved the military, even back then. And that comes from my relatives who already lived here. My dad, however, moved here in the 50s with my mom, and then we were born. But we kind of had that support network already where we had family in Los Angeles, and they helped us out, and they helped find jobs, and so we had relationships. And that military interest came from that part of the family.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So your parents sign you over. What happens then?
Yeah, basically. And they signed me over, and I graduated from high school barely. And about a month later, I got on an airplane for the first time in my life from LA International Airport, flew to Dallas, and this was August 4th, 1981. I remember it clearly. And then I was supposed to board another plane to Lawton, Oklahoma. And I came from it was like a DC-4, DC-10 airliner, and they put me on a little prop plane with no air conditioning. I had to walk out of the tarmac, and I never felt this humidity in my life because I never left California until then. And I'm on a plane with like 4 other guys, long hair, heading towards Lawton, Oklahoma. And that's where we went to boot camp at Fort Sill. And that was, the summer of 81. And that's where my military career began, August 4th, 1981, boot camp. I was 17.
Right. And how much of a shock to the system was boot camp from what you were used to?
It was, in many ways, it was a big shock. In some ways, I could handle it. The biggest shock was the environment, the weather, the humidity, the fact that I was with all kinds of people from different cultures. I'm Mexican American, and I grew up in a pretty much Mexican American community. So I was with African Americans, with Orientals, with Caucasians, and of course, just getting up at 4 a.m, all the yelling, all the no excuse kind of attitude. And part of the shock was, my God, I have to work for a living. And I really didn't learn that out in the streets of LA. Part of what helped me, though, is, and this sounds very ironic and maybe cynical in a way, but my dad and we had a very bad relationship, and he was physically abusive and mentally abusive. So when a drill sergeant came to me and started threatening me and belittling me and trying to push my buttons, that part really didn't faze me. The part that I struggled with was, of course, all the physical requirements, all the attention to detail, all the constant going, no work, and keeping money. And in 1981, they pretty much stopped hitting trainees. They could do everything but hit you, is what I'm saying.
Right.
And they would make you stand there, with your rifle, an M16, which doesn't weigh a whole lot, straight up. But if you hold it that way for 45 minutes, it feels like a ton of bricks. The fact that you didn't sleep much, and if you forgot your water, well, you know what? So sad. It was your problem. If you didn't fill up your canteens, it was on you. If you didn't check your boots and put powder in your socks, that was on you. If you forgot something, it was you, and you had to fix it. And that's what I learned. Cause and effect. You don't do something, communicate it. You don't have a plan. Chances are something's not going to work out. The physical part was pretty easy for me for the most part because I used to do paper routes walking, and I used to put on like 40 pounds of newspapers and walk around the neighborhood. That's what I did when I was in high school. Mm-hmm. So that part was okay. But the long marches, and what my drill sergeant called LPCs. We're going to go to the training or the rifle range via LPCs. I'm like, oh, cool. We don't have to walk. Well, LPCs, if some people may or may not know this, they're referred to as leather personnel carriers, i.e. boots. And, 26 miles, oh my God, that kind of with a 50-pound pack and full combat gear. That was rough. But it was also fun because as a 17-year-old, I wanted to play Army. And boot camp was 12 weeks back then for artillery. So I just remember making some lifelong friends, and just the fact that I was 17 and I made it. And to me, that was a big badge of honor because, they would say, well, you're just a 17-year-old blank, blank, blank. You're not going to go anywhere. If you make it, I'm going to laugh. That's another thing. Well, I'll show you. Plus, they fed us really good. I came from East LA where I was just used to tortillas, tamales, all that good Mexican food. Mm-hmm. They started feeding us stuff I never even had in my life, like catfish and chili mac. And the Army fed me really good. I have fun memories of that even to this day, So I was 17. I was making money. I was blowing stuff up. After about the fourth week of boot camp, I loved it. I thought I found a home. In fact, we had a cadence. We'd sing, and I don't know how it goes. I like it here. I love it here. I finally found my home. Hey, as you're marching.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was my start, my induction, if you will, to military life at 17.
Wow. I mean, I can't imagine dealing with that at 17, and I'm sure a lot of 17-year-olds nowadays can't really imagine that. But it's still, there's people are still recruited at that age, even though, I just find it surprising that you can be recruited at that age yet you're not old enough to vote in any election or anything like that.
Yeah, and that was the ironic part. But again, and this is just me, I really didn't think about this kind of things. My whole thing was survival and getting out, and wanting to be treated equally. And I can tell you this, Ian, in the Army, you were all treated equally. You were equally worthless unless you had to prove yourself. And the thought of voting didn't even come to my attention. I mean, until later. I remember my 18th birthday, I was stationed in Fort Riley, Kansas. It's like, oh, I can vote now. So it was kind of backwards. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I never thought about that right and that privilege. For me, like I said, it was more survival. I just want to get out of LA. I want to get out of my situation.
Yeah. No, I can fully understand that from obviously, what you've described. So when you complete the basic training, which I think you said was 12 weeks.
Yeah.
And then what happens then? You're still remaining in the US?
Well, back then, the thought of anybody going into the military was not very popular. It was post-Vietnam. And a lot of, I don't know about the Air Force, but the Army, they were offering bonuses for you to join up. I remember I got like a $3,000 bonus or something just for going artillery. And that's probably another reason why I did that. So when I graduated, even before I graduated, I knew I was going to go to boot camp. And even before boot camp ended, I already knew my duty assignment. Some guys didn't. Some guys had enlisted and they weren't delayed entry program. They got assigned wherever. They had no idea. But when I was at the reception station at the start of boot camp and they were issuing uniforms, some guys were getting patches sewn on their uniforms. And I was one of them. And they put the 1st Infantry Division patch on mine. And that's because I already been assigned to the Fort Riley, Kansas 1st Infantry Division. So I knew where I was going after graduation. And a lot of people who did delayed entry did as well. I remember seeing some guys with the 82nd, excuse me, airborne 101st. And they already knew, well, after boot camp, I'm going to jump school, then I'm going to be assigned to Fort Bragg or Fort Benning or whatever. And that was the same case with me. I didn't want to go airborne. I just wanted to do artillery. But I was already assigned to 1st Infantry Division pending my graduation. I remember getting 10 days leave and then reporting to Fort Riley in the winter of 81. And then when I got there, they assigned me to a specific battalion. At that time, if memory serves me well, the 1st Infantry Division had 4 brigades. 3 of them were Fort Riley, Kansas. One of them was called Forward Brigade in Germany, down, I think, around maybe Mannheim, Wurzburg area. Mm-hmm. I may be wrong there, Ian. I don't know, but
I'm not going to test you. I'm not going to test you on it later. So,
well, I like these kind of things. I like to see, who is where. I find those things interesting.
Yeah.
But I was assigned to 1st Infantry Division Replacement Detachment, which is basically the reception center. Once you got there, you get your paperwork, you get more your winter gear, blah blah blah, and then you go to this desk and they find out what your MOS is, which is basically your military occupational specialist. And your paperwork says, well, you're a 13 Bravo, you're artillery. Okay, so you're going to go to an artillery unit. And I went to Charlie Battery, 3rd Battalion, 6th Field Artillery, which was part of the 3 brigades that made up the division at Fort Riley. Mm-hmm. And I knew that was my duty assignment. So I already knew pretty much. But like I said, a lot of guys, when they joined, it wasn't delayed entry. They just went in. They got their orders maybe a week before graduation. And, I'm going to Germany. I'm going to Korea. And the guys with the patches, well, we already know where we're going to go unless we didn't graduate.
Yeah.
So a lot of that was predetermined, based on the agreement you made before you were enlisted. And my enlistment, I had a bonus. And if I passed, I'd get the bonus and I'd be assigned to Fort Riley. And why Fort Riley, I don't know. They gave me a few choices. And I remember one being Fort Riley, Kansas. And I just remember saying, as far away as California as you can get me. That's where I want to go. So I'm surprised I didn't wind up in Korea or Turkey or Greece. But I went to Fort Riley and I signed the papers in December of 80, like 7-8 months before I even went in. So that's how that worked at the time.
Okay. And at this point, you weren't trained in artillery. You'd just gone through the basic training. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. It was called One Station Unit Training. It was basically 3 months of boot camp. And if memory serves me well, artillery was towards the end of it. Kind of like the AIT. You know what that means, Ian?
No, I don't.
That's AIT, like a specialized school, advanced individual training.
Right.
Artillery and boot camp were meshed into like 12 weeks, and you did all your training there, then included your specialty, which is artillery. At about maybe the 8th week, we did all our basic, rifle marksmanship, obstacle courses, NBC, nuclear, chemical, biological. Mm-hmm. And then we started going into the artillery training and the introduction and the kind of artillery pieces we had. And I remember we did train on 2 specific kinds of artillery pieces for 4 weeks. It was the M110, which was it was called the 8-inch, and that was basically a massive cannon that had no cover. It was like a cannon on wheels, basically.
Yeah.
And then also the M109, which was a 155 millimeter, and it looked more like a tank. It was self-propelled also, and that was covered. And then we also had it was either the M102 or M105, which is a smaller artillery piece, and that was a towed piece, which means that was hooked up behind a truck or it was airdropped. So I remember training in those 3 areas. And I remember just the weight of some of those artillery rounds. Like, oh my God. I mean, I was 17, I was buff because of that. But the artillery rounds were amazing. They started you off with familiarization, and then they got into map reading and calculating. In the old days, we had to use maps with grids, and then you would do a little bit of basic math and put it into a little piece of paper, and they'll give you your, quadrant and deflection. If I'm thinking correctly, quadrant was elevation was up and down, and quadrant was left and right.
Mm-hmm.
And then what they did is someone would give us mock coordinates, and we'd be timed. We have to pull the cannon up, pull it down manually, by the way.
Yeah.
Not electronically. We didn't have that yet. I think the M110 and 155 did, but we still have to do that. And then there was a whole section on the actual rounds. We basically trained with HE, high explosive rounds, but we also got to do loom rounds, and that was beautiful, I guess. To see it blow up in the night sky.
What a loom! Illumination.
Yeah, loom rounds.
Illumination rounds.
Yeah, and then they would show us a different kind of rounds and the fuses and the timing on the fuses and the kind of fuses. You had the time on target. You could adjust the time. You had just the impact fuses. So we got to do all that, and I remember we had to go through a cycle where you were broken up, and you had to go through. First of all, can you do the elevation? Can you set a fuse? Can you actually put the fuse on the artillery piece? Can you identify the artillery round? What's the maximum distance? We never trained with white phosphorus at boot camp or chemical rounds, obviously. But we did a lot of high explosive, and that was a big rush. I just remember pulling the lanyard, like towards the end, where you had to actually qualify to make your test, your graduation requirements, and part of it was you had to fire a live round. And that was probably the biggest high, if you will, that a 17-year-old can have, to pulling the lanyard on a 155 millimeter round, having the impact and the recoil, and maybe 30 seconds later hearing an explosion, or seeing it light up the sky late at night over Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
It was a head rush for a 17-year-old.
Yeah.
So at that time, I'm happy. This is what I'm going to do for a while.
Yeah. What was your role in the artillery team, or was everybody interchangeable in terms of their role?
In boot camp, they trained you like it was assistant gunner, ammo, communication, RTO, radio telephone operator, driver. Once you got to your unit, you were expected to know all parts of those roles. And when I got to my unit, I was an E1. And so I got assigned ammo, which means I had to work my way up. What you do in ammo, you unload the rounds, basically, and you give them to the guys on the artillery pieces. And each battery, at least for an 8-inch battery back in those days, we had 4 artillery pieces per battery. And I was assigned to ammo, which was I wasn't worthy to be on a gun yet. I had to prove myself. So I had to upload the rounds physically, unload them, put them on the tray, take off the packaging, and then you would work your way up. Then I would be like an assistant where I actually took the artillery round and prepped it, put the right fuse on it, make sure it's the right kind of round, and put it on a tray, which was hydraulically driven at the time. And now we're talking about the M110, which is a bigger piece. It's an 8-inch round. And then if you proved yourself there or the sergeant liked you, then you worked your way up to assistant gunner, and then the actual guy who pulled the lanyard. The gunner itself was usually the sergeant or corporal or the section chief. That was more of a more highly trained specialty, and I think that even required more training at a school. But that was for the higher up NCOs.
Right.
So basically you had to work your way up. But another thing to keep in mind, in 1981, we were really short people. No one wanted to join the Army, at least from what I can recall. They had to give bonuses. And there was always a shortage, so you had to do multiple things. Like you load the round, and then I was the assistant gunner, and then since I was right next to the lanyard, I just pull the lanyard, be the actual one that says battery, stand by, battery, fire, and then you pull the lanyard. So I remember having multiple jobs at one time.
When you finished that training, you were almost straight into a Reforger exercise.
That is correct. I got to Fort Raleigh in November of 81, right before my 18th birthday. And like I told you just earlier, you had to go through the reception station and grab all your gear. Then you get assigned to your unit on base. And Fort Riley at the time was massive. It was like a little city. There might have been, I'm taking a guess, maybe 14, 15,000 troops there at the time, plus their dependents and plus the civilian workers. And I remember reporting to my duty station and my battery commander saying, well, you joined us at a good time. We're just starting training for a Reforger. And of course, I'm an E1. This is a captain. I didn't even ask him what a Reforger was until I got to my section chief. And I said, what the heck's Reforger? And he said, oh, it's Return of Forces Germany. You're going to have fun. Don't worry about it. So I said, okay. But as time went on, all the training revolved around that. We used to go to the field maybe 5-6 days out of the month. We'd be in garrison doing maintenance, doing training, doing classrooms. And then that would accumulate every month of going out to the field and doing live fire exercises. And I remember January of 82. Oh, my God. Keep in mind, I came from California. I'm in the middle of Kansas. And it was like 32 below zero with the wind chill factor. And I had no idea why I chose to do that. But you couldn't say no. You couldn't back out. You had to be a man and suck it up. And we trained. And the end goal, the end result was getting ready for Reforger, which wasn't until September of 82. So we started training for Reforger in January, about 8-9 months. And under severe weather circumstances, in Kansas, as you probably know, maybe you don't know, but it's in the Midwest and it's very cold in the wintertime. And then in the springtime, you have the winds and tornadoes. And they actually called us back in from the field when we had a tornado in the spring of 82. But outside of that, they didn't care if it's rained, snowed, or it was 100 degrees. Yeah. You trained.
The only reason I'm familiar with Kansas and tornadoes is The Wizard of Oz.
Well, there you go. There you go, Ian. That's close enough. I was in the land of Oz. It was pretty wild. But I also remember, as we got closer to Reforger, they kept changing the dates on us and when we would leave. Like, you ever heard the saying, hurry up and wait?
Yes.
Well, I learned what that meant very quickly. We're supposed to leave on September, and please, I'm just making this one up, but I know it was in September of 82. We're going to leave on September 1st. Okay, so we have a pre-inspection on the 31st. We have a pre-inspection from the division, and then we have, even before that, it keeps going farther down, like the brigade and the battalion and the batteries and the section. And we did that like for 2 weeks. We pack and unpack, and we'd sit around and wait. And we're supposed to leave on September 1st, and then they changed it to September 3rd. Now, I'm just making that date up, but I know it was in September. And then they changed it again. We're the 7th. No, now we're leaving on the 6th. And I asked my section chief, why do they do that? I was like, oh, we're trying to throw off any kind of terrorist possibilities. So even back then, they were aware and conscious of terrorism acts.
Right.
So the whole training, the whole cycle, if you will, was to get ready for Reforger. And Reforger lasted for us, God, must have been about a month and a half, from September to maybe mid-October of 82.
Okay.
And boy, that's a whole different story there.
And the terrorism acts that they were fearful of were in Germany or in the US?
More in Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the 80s, that was very rare. But I remember my section telling me, well, we're trying to throw off the schedules. Like if we're all flying into Frankfurt, I knew that, Rhein-Main Air Base, and people were watching. So they wanted to throw off like the units that were coming in. That's the way I understood it. But I also remember once we got there, it was nonstop, like boom, 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 boom. No time to even think. You just had to do what you're trained to do.
Yeah.
And
what sort of planes did you fly out on?
We flew out of Topeka, Kansas, and I don't remember. It was an Air Force plane. I don't recall the nomenclature or the number, but we sat backwards, and we had the harnesses and, the straps. It was an Air Force plane. I think, correct me again, Ian, maybe a C-5 something. I don't remember.
Okay. No, I was just wondering whether they were civilian airliners that have been requisitioned or...
Well, I flew both, actually. We went military, and we flew into Rhine-Main. But first we stopped somewhere in northeastern Canada, Newfoundland, somewhere, to refuel, and then they let us switch our legs. And it was dark already, and I think it was like maybe 6 in the afternoon. And I've never been to Canada either. I wanted to go out and look. Oh no, you're sitting on the base. No one goes anywhere. Sit here and wait. And then we got back on. We refueled, and we flew into Rhine-Main. Now after Reforger, this is interesting. We flew back on a 747, and it was at the time an airline called Pan Am. I'm sure it doesn't exist anymore. I know it doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't. No, I remember Pan Am.
Yeah, it was a 747, and like, again, wow, I've never flown a 747. So that was a civilian flight, and we flew back to Kansas on a civilian flight. And, you know, we had pretty stewardesses, and we got food. So it was a different environment. It's more like a party environment. Yeah. I don't remember if they didn't let us drink, but, you know, you were going home. So that felt good. And when we got home, we got a few days off. And I remember it being a civilian aircraft because I'd never flown a 747 before.
So when you arrive at Rhine-Main, what happened then? Were you straight out and sent to your M110s, or what happens? Well, that's it for today's episode, but we have got more from Manuel. We will be talking in a further episode about his experiences on that Reforger exercise. Don't forget to visit the show notes at coldwarconversations.com, where there's links, videos and details of books that will help you discover more about today's episode. If you can't wait for our next episode, do visit the Facebook discussion group, where our guests and listeners, just like you, continue the Cold War conversation. Just go to our website, coldwarconversations.com, and click on the Join the Conversation option. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.